How does a girl who was abused rise to become a powerful queen? That is the question that doesn't have an easy answer, but it's the journey of tragedy and determination that defines Arsinoe II, a young woman caught in the deadly game of power within the royal family of Egypt. In a world where thrones and secrets are traded like currency, where vows of loyalty are broken and political schemes unfold behind closed doors, Arsinoe II was forced to turn her deepest wounds into the very source of her strength. Life in the Ptolemaic royal family was never a fairy tale. Everything was measured in power, and from the very start of her life, Arsinoe never had the chance to be an innocent child, born to Pharaoh Ptolemy, the daughter of a man who was not just her father, but also an absolute ruler. Arsinoe II was dragged into the web of power and control from her earliest days. Little did she know that the luxurious life filled with riches and beauty would turn out to be a gilded cage, one that stifled every dream she could have had. While the world around her was steeped in grandeur with towering pyramids and opulent palaces, Arsinoe II felt trapped. She was caught in the game of kings never allowed to escape. Every move she made was dictated by others. Every choice in her life was already preordained. Those around her saw her as nothing more than a pawn in their grand chess game. And that's where the tragedy began, where the story of loss and survival turned into something greater, the rise of a queen. Arsinoe II wasn't just a girl abused within the walls of her royal family. She was a queen, a mother, a wife, and a politician. She was the embodiment of personal pain and strategic decisions. But to truly understand her, we must go back to the very moment her family's grip on her life tightened. From her childhood, Arsinoe II was drawn into the brutal power struggles between the forces vying for control of the empire. Every action she took was not just her decision as an individual, but a part of a ruthless political game that she never chose to play. The people around her, from her father to her powerful relatives, used her as a tool for their own ambitions. And this is how the tragic story began, one not only of loss, but also of survival. Arsinoe II was not merely a girl wronged within her royal family. She was a queen in the making, a woman forged from pain and purpose, ready to rise from the ashes of her past, to claim what was hers. But to understand her full journey, we must first understand the world in which she was born. And when the outside world offered her no respite, Arsinoe II had no choice but to create her own path. One forged in suffering, one that would ultimately shape her into the queen she would become. The big question now: how does a girl who was abused rise to become a powerful queen? That is the story of Arsinoe II, tragic yet undeniably strong. After the death of Alexander the Great, the world was left in chaos, a vast empire suddenly without a ruler, and the balance of power shattered. His generals, once united under his banner, now turned on each other. The empire, once unified under a single man's vision, splintered into territories, each one fiercely contested by those who believed they were worthy to take his place. In the midst of this tumult, Egypt became a prize. And it was there that Ptolemy I, a trusted general of Alexander, seized his chance. He took control of Egypt, founding the Ptolemaic dynasty, and with it, he created an environment of cutthroat competition and ruthless ambition. But this wasn't just about empires and thrones. This was about family. For Arsinoe II, the power struggles of Egypt weren't just political, they were personal. Raised in the shadow of a father who wielded absolute power, she became trapped in a web of control and manipulation, a pawn in a much larger game. From an early age, Arsinoe's life was defined by the political machinations of her father. While she was raised in luxury and surrounded by the beauty of the Egyptian court, her true purpose was always clear: to solidify her father's power, and in doing so further the ambitions of the Ptolemaic dynasty. As the Ptolemaic kingdom was built on the backs of its royal family, Arsinoe II's life was not her own. She was forced into the game of power where her value was measured not by her desires, but by how well she could serve the interests of the family and the dynasty. The relationship between Arsinoe II and her father was complicated. Ptolemy I, who had conquered Egypt with brutal efficiency, was a man who held immense control over his family. To him, Arsinoe was not just a daughter, but a tool to be used in the pursuit of greater power. As a young girl, Arsinoe had little choice but to obey, her life dictated by the whims of her father. She was raised in a world where love was secondary to politics, and loyalty was measured by how well you served the dynasty's needs. This was the harsh reality Arsinoe II had to face, a life in which the bonds of family were forged through power, and the price of betrayal was often too high to pay. As the struggle for dominance over Egypt and the empire unfolded, Arsinoe II found herself caught in the middle of a war that she didn't start but would ultimately help shape. The death of Alexander was just the beginning of a much larger, more personal battle for the throne, and Arsinoe would have to navigate the treacherous waters of royal politics, where every move was scrutinized. But one thing became clear in the world of the Ptolemaic dynasty: power was the ultimate currency, and Arsinoe II was about to learn how to wield it like a queen. Power has a way of twisting people. What was once a daughter's innocent trust in her father became something much darker under the weight of a man consumed by ambition. Arsinoe II, once an innocent child, was now forced into a relationship with her father that no child should ever endure. As the ruler of Egypt, Ptolemy, who was both father and king, and in his mind the line between those two roles blurred. But for Arsinoe, the blurring of that line meant betrayal, the kind of betrayal that would mark her for life. In a world where women were seen as tools to secure power rather than people with their own agency, Arsinoe's tragic fate was almost inevitable. As the daughter of Ptolemy I, she was groomed to serve the needs of the dynasty, but no one could have prepared her for the horrific reality that awaited her within the walls of the royal palace. What began as a relationship between a father and daughter turned into something monstrous. As Ptolemy, I used his power over her, not just politically, but personally, exploiting his position as both father and king. The nature of the abuse was hidden behind the royal facade, buried under layers of political intrigue and public appearances. To the outside world, Ptolemy I was the strong, wise ruler of Egypt. But behind closed doors, the father who was supposed to protect his daughter became her tormentor. Arsinoe was no longer just a princess. She became an unwilling pawn in the most twisted game of all. This violation, this abuse of power, marked a turning point for Arsinoe II. It was in this moment, stripped of her innocence, that she realized the brutal truth: the world around her was not what it seemed. Love and protection were lies. The only thing that mattered was power, and in a world built on exploitation, survival meant understanding how to wield that power. The girl who had once looked to her father for guidance now saw him for what he truly was: a ruler, willing to sacrifice anyone, including his own daughter, for the sake of the throne. The betrayal shattered her. But instead of crumbling, Arsinoe became something else. She began to adapt, to learn. The child who had been helpless was now a woman with a deep understanding of the political game. The violation, painful as it was, forged her into a person of immense resilience. And with that resilience came a newfound understanding of the world of power she was caught in. For Arsinoe, there was no going back. The sweet innocence of her childhood was gone, replaced by the cold reality of survival. From that moment on, she would no longer be a passive player in the royal game. She would be a queen, taking control of her destiny and using the very system that had betrayed her to secure her place at the top. Betrayal, especially when it comes from the very people who are supposed to love and protect you, cuts deeper than any blade. For Arsinoe II, the realization that her father, the man who should have been her protector, had become her abuser, was the wound that would never fully heal. But in that wound, she found the roots of a strength that would shape her destiny. The psychological toll of the betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was a slow-burning fire that forged her into a master strategist, a woman who learned to use her pain as fuel. The girl who once looked to her father for guidance now saw him as the embodiment of everything she despised in the world. She realized that in the court of the Ptolemies, power was the only language that mattered. Arsinoe's heart, once pure and full of hope, turned cold, with the realization that the world was not a place of justice or kindness. Instead, it was a battlefield where the strong survive by any means necessary. The more she reflected on her situation, the more she understood that the only way to escape the cage her father had placed her in was to make herself stronger than him, to outsmart the very system that had hurt her. And so Arsinoe began to transform. She studied the political dynamics of Egypt and the larger Mediterranean world with a sharpness that would make even the most seasoned strategist take pause. She learned to manipulate the players around her using her beauty intelligence and royal connections to her advantage. Every word she spoke was carefully chosen, every smile designed to disarm her enemies. She understood now that to survive in this world, she had to become something more than a victim. She had to become a queen. And not just any queen. She would be the queen who ruled not just with the power of her title, but with the cunning of a predator, the resilience of a survivor, and the iron will of someone who had nothing left to lose. The heartbreak, the abuse, the violation, these would not define her. Instead, they would fuel her rise to power. Arsinoe II no longer saw herself as a pawn in her father's game. She would be the queen who played the game on her own terms, the one who would carve a new path. But power was not just a matter of personal strength. It was a matter of perception. To the world, Arsinoe needed to appear not only strong, but untouchable. And that meant she had to keep her emotions hidden. The woman who would eventually rise to rule Egypt had to be more than just a survivor. She had to be a symbol of unyielding strength, someone who could never be broken. The first step toward that transformation had begun. Arsinoe was no longer the fragile girl who had been betrayed by her father. She was becoming the woman who would rewrite the rules of the game. In the world of ancient Egypt, alliances were forged through blood power and marriage, not love. And for Arsinoe II, her next step in the ruthless game of thrones was a strategic marriage, one that would allow her to strengthen her position and elevate her influence. But this wasn't about love. It was about power control and using every available tool to climb higher in a world where loyalty was fleeting. Arsinoe's first marriage was not a love match, but a political maneuver. She was married off to Lysimachus, a respected general under Ptolemy I. Lysimachus was a seasoned soldier loyal to her father, but to Arsinoe he was little more than a stepping stone, a means to an end. Their union, while politically advantageous, was marred by the same cold calculation that defined so much of Arsinoe's life. She didn't seek affection in Lysimachus. She sought power, stability, and a stronger position in the ever-shifting sands of the royal court. The marriage to Lysimachus was not without its advantages. He was a respected leader, and their union solidified her place in the royal family. But Arsinoe wasn't naive. She knew that her position was still tenuous, especially with the volatile political environment surrounding her. Egypt was a land of ambition, and she had to ensure that she was always one step ahead of her enemies, both in the court and beyond. As the queen, Arsinoe began to weave a web of political alliances. She worked quietly behind the scenes, using her beauty, wit, and strategic thinking to win the loyalty of key figures in her husband's army and the royal court. She became a master manipulator, pulling the strings from the shadows while appearing the dutiful wife in public. Every interaction, every conversation was a calculated move to secure her future. But Arsinoe was more than just a pawn in someone else's game. She was learning the art of control, of using her relationships not for affection, but for dominance. Lysimachus, though powerful in his own right, was no match for her intellect and ambition. While she outwardly played the role of the supportive queen, inwardly, she was building a network of power that would allow her to take control. Her marriage to Lysimachus was the first step in her journey of power. It gave her a foothold, but it was only the beginning. Arsinoe knew that true power was not just about the men you married, but just as Arsinoe began to solidify, her power tragedy struck. Lysimachus, her political partner and husband, died unexpectedly. The loss sent shockwaves through her life. Though their marriage had never been built on love, his death left Arsinoe vulnerable. She had lost her political anchor, the man who had solidified her position within the royal family. She was forced to face the harsh reality of her situation. In the world of the Ptolemies, there was no room for weakness, not even for a queen. In the aftermath of his death, Arsinoe II was once again left to navigate a perilous world, but this time she had learned much. She had become stronger, more cunning, and more capable of surviving on her own. She didn't mourn the loss of Lysimachus the man, but rather the loss of the position he had given her. Now she would have to climb higher on her own, using everything she had learned about power and manipulation. Power doesn't just corrupt from the outside, it breeds betrayal from within. For Arsinoe II, the betrayal didn't come from her enemies. It came from the people closest to her. The very family that she had been raised to defend, the family that had once controlled her life, would now become the source of her greatest threat. Lysimachus's sudden death was a devastating blow, but it also opened up a dangerous power vacuum that Arsinoe could no longer ignore. She was now vulnerable, her position as queen precarious at best. The moment the throne shifted in her favor, it was as if every eye in the royal court turned to her with distrust, hoping to seize the advantage. But Arsinoe had learned to survive through manipulation. But while Arsinoe was preparing for the next political move, she was blindsided by betrayal from within her own family. Her sister Arsinoe had always been a figure in the background, no threat to Arsinoe's power, or so it seemed. Arsinoe, who had once been a trusted ally, was quietly plotting against her. When it became clear that Arsinoe had no intention of relinquishing her power, Arsinoe took drastic action. Arsinoe's move was swift and calculated. With the backing of several powerful courtiers who were dissatisfied with Arsinoe's methods of rule, she forced Arsinoe out of power. In a heart-wrenching display of family loyalty turned sour, Arsinoe's own sister orchestrated her forced exile from the throne. The betrayal was not just political, it was personal. Arsinoe, who had once been a part of Arsinoe's closest circle, turned against her with a ruthlessness that mirrored the same power-hungry traits Arsinoe had once learned to despise. This betrayal struck deeper than any political maneuver. For Arsinoe, the sting of family turning against her felt like the ultimate abandonment. The same betrayal she had experienced as a child was now amplified. As she was pushed aside, Arsinoe retreated into the shadows, her mind sharpening like a blade. Her once wounded heart began to steel itself. She could no longer rely on the loyalty of her family, and that realization propelled her into action. She would rise again, not just as a queen, but as a woman who would not be broken by the treachery of those closest to her. The lesson she learned was harsh, but it was invaluable. Power, no matter how firmly grasped, was fleeting, especially in a family as treacherous as hers. She couldn't afford to trust anyone. She would have to reclaim her throne, but this time she would do it without relying on anyone else. The family she had tried to protect would be the very ones who would have to face the consequences of their actions. As the political landscape shifted once again, Arsinoe began to rebuild her strength, making alliances where necessary and preparing for the final confrontation with those who had betrayed her. This was no longer a fight for survival. This was a fight for her legacy. She was determined to show the world and her family that no betrayal, no matter how severe, would keep her from the throne. In a world where power was everything, Arsinoe II was no stranger to making the most of even the most controversial alliances. The next step in her political ascent was a move that would shock not only Egypt, a marriage to her brother Ptolemy II. While the practice of royal incest was not uncommon in ancient Egypt, this union would go down in history as one of the most politically charged and contentious moves ever made. To many, this marriage was an act of desperation, a final attempt to cling to the throne that had been taken from her. But to Arsinoe, it was a strategic masterpiece, one that would give her the means to control Egypt and the Ptolemaic dynasty with her own hands. Marriage in her world was no longer about love or family. It was a political weapon. By marrying her brother, Arsinoe II secured her place not only as queen, but also as the most powerful woman in Egypt. She would now have the ability to dictate the course of the Ptolemaic dynasty. This wasn't a partnership built on affection. It was a partnership built on power. Each party using the other to achieve their goals. Ptolemy II, for all his royal blood, was not the power player that Arsinoe had become. He was a figurehead, a man whose reign was marked more by spectacle than by substance. But Arsinoe was no ordinary queen. She quickly learned to manipulate her brother using his position to further her own agenda. Every move he made, every decree he signed, was influenced by her, whether he knew it or not. The marriage marked the beginning of Arsinoe's true ascent to power. No longer was she the victim of betrayal and abuse. She was now the one who controlled the narrative. She had learned the lessons of survival and power lessons she had been taught by her father's abuse, her sister's betrayal, and the political game she had played in the shadows. And now, with Ptolemy II by her side, she would ensure that no one, not even the gods themselves, could take her throne from her. But Arsinoe's rise was not without complications. The court, as always, was a dangerous place, filled with intrigue, jealousy, and ambition. Though Ptolemy II was her husband, his loyalty was never truly hers. He was a pawn in a much larger game, and Arsinoe knew that she had to be vigilant, for there were always enemies lurking in the shadows waiting for a chance to strike. In the wake of her marriage to Ptolemy II, Arsinoe began to build her own power base. She surrounded herself with loyalists, military commanders, diplomats, and royal advisors who owed their allegiance to her alone. She knew that in the dangerous world of ancient Egypt, power was never secure. Her political maneuvering paid off as she began to consolidate power. She was no longer just a queen, she was the puppet master pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The court, once filled with whispers of her political cunning and ruthless ambition, now reverberated with awe and fear. Arsinoe II was a force to be reckoned with. But even in the midst of her growing dominance, there was one thing Arsinoe could never forget: the price of power. As she solidified her control, she knew that the very people she manipulated could just as easily manipulate her. The Game of Thrones was unending, and no one, no matter how powerful, could ever truly sit on the throne forever without risking everything. As Arsinoe II solidified her place on the throne, her rule became marked not by her title, but by her uncompromising execution of power. Now that she had the crown and the royal marriage that secured her legitimacy, she set her sights on building an empire that would be all her own. What began as a struggle for survival turned into a ruthless campaign to create a dynasty that would bear her mark. Arsinoe had learned early that power was not just about holding a title, it was about controlling the machinery of the state. She understood that without the support of the military, the priesthood, and the court, she began to carefully cultivate alliances with Egypt's military leaders, ensuring their loyalty by rewarding them with positions of power and land. Through cunning diplomacy and deft political maneuvering. But Arsinoe wasn't only concerned with the military, she also knew that control over religion and the priesthood was paramount. The Ptolemaic dynasty had long used the gods to legitimize their rule, and Arsinoe followed suit, carefully positioning herself as both a queen and a divine figure. She began to present herself as the earthly representative of the gods, often invoking their favor in her public appearances. Through these methods, Arsinoe II built her own empire, a personal kingdom within the Ptolemaic dynasty. She ruled not as a puppet of her brother or anyone else, but as the undisputed queen of Egypt. Her decisions were law, and her word was final. The royal court, once filled with factions and whispers of betrayal, now had a single, unchallenged ruler. But with power came enemies. And as Arsinoe continued to consolidate her rule, she began to remove anyone who might pose a threat to her reign. The purge was swift and brutal. Politicians, advisors, and military leaders who were once loyal to her family were executed or exiled without mercy. Arsinoe knew that there could be no room for weakness in her court. Yet even as she eliminated potential rivals, she never allowed her empire to become a dictatorship. Arsinoe understood the importance of public perception. She used her newfound power to enact reforms that benefited the common people. In doing so, she secured the loyalty of the people who began to see her not just as a queen, but as a ruler who cared about their well-being. In this way, Arsinoe II didn't just become a queen, she became an empire unto herself. She was no longer a pawn in the game of power. She was the one who set the rules. And in the midst of all the intrigue, the power struggles, and the betrayals, Arsinoe stood at the top of it all, holding her kingdom together with an iron fist wrapped in the velvet of diplomacy. Yet as her power grew, so too did the weight of it. For in the Game of Thrones, no ruler could ever rest on their laurels. Power was fleeting, and enemies were never far behind. Arsinoe had learned that lesson early, and she knew that the cost of ruling was always high. But for Arsinoe II, the price was one she was willing to pay. She would not let her empire slip away. As Arsinoe II's power grew, so did her ambitions. Now that she had solidified her position on the throne and established her empire, she moved to implement policies that would further her control. These weren't policies designed for the common good. No, Arsinoe's policies were bold, daring, and shockingly controversial, designed not only to maintain her power, but to ensure that no one could threaten her reign. Her most infamous policy came in the form of royal marriages. As queen, she decreed that incestuous marriages within the royal family were to be normalized, no longer seen as taboo, but rather as a political tool to maintain the purity of the bloodline and consolidate power within the ruling family. This wasn't just about her own marriage to her brother Ptolemy II. It was about the Ptolemaic dynasty as a whole. She set the precedent for future rulers to marry within their own family, ensuring that the throne would always be kept within the bloodline. But her most shocking act was the justification she gave for this policy. Arsinoe claimed that the gods themselves had ordained such unions using their divine will as a shield for her actions. The royal family, she argued, was the direct descendant of the gods, and therefore it was only natural that the bloodline be preserved through marriages between siblings. This audacious declaration shocked even the most loyal of her courtiers, but it was effective. Arsinoe had crafted a narrative that positioned her as not just a queen, but a living deity. Her policies weren't limited to the royal family, however. Arsinoe set about reshaping the very fabric of Egyptian society, demanding loyalty at all costs. Anyone suspected of disloyalty was swiftly dealt with. Her enemies were eliminated with ruthless efficiency, executed, exiled, or silenced. Arsinoe had no room for weakness in her court, and her policies ensured that those around her remained in line. Arsinoe's political reforms didn't stop at the elimination of rivals, however. She strengthened her control over the military and the economy, ensuring that she was not just the queen, but the undisputed ruler. Through the control of grain supplies, taxes, and trade routes, she cemented her economic dominance. She had learned from her father and others before her power was not just about military strength. While these policies kept her firmly in control, they also sowed the seeds of discontent. The very foundation of her power, built on fear and loyalty, was starting to crack. The oppressive rule, the incestuous marriages, and the purges of her enemies all left a trail of bitterness in their wake. But Arsinoe, ever the strategist, knew that the cost of power was high. The public might not have openly challenged her, but whispers of dissent began to spread. There were those who believed her policies were a sign of her madness. Some of the people who had once supported her saw her as a ruler who had lost touch. But Arsinoe was too far along in her journey to care about the whispers. She had built her empire with blood, sweat, and the manipulation of every tool at her disposal. Now that she had it, she would do whatever it took to keep it. For Arsinoe II, power wasn't just about sitting on the throne. It was about creating a legacy that would endure no matter the cost. She knew that the actions she took today would echo through history. And while the consequences of her policies were yet to be seen, one thing was certain: Arsinoe II would be remembered. Not just as a queen, but as the woman who reshaped Egypt according to her will. As Arsinoe II's power reached its peak, the very foundations of her empire began to crack. She had done what many thought impossible. She had cemented her rule, conquered her enemies, and manipulated every corner of Egypt's political system. But in the pursuit of absolute control, she had forgotten one key factor: time. Time was both her greatest ally and her most dangerous enemy. Her reign had been built on a precarious balance, a balance of fear, manipulation, and sheer willpower. But even the strongest empires begin to weaken when the foundation is not built on trust or loyalty. As Arsinoe continued to purge her enemies, eliminate rivals, and tighten her grip, the people of Egypt began to feel the weight of her rule. The very policies that had given her the power to rule with an iron fist, the royal family, once united by blood and ambition, was beginning to show cracks. The incestuous marriages that Arsinoe had once embraced as a way to preserve power began to backfire. Her own family members, once loyal allies, began to question her methods. Arsinoe's brother Ptolemy II, who had once been her political partner, became a shadow of the ruler he once was. But the true turning point came when Arsinoe's hold on the military began to weaken. The soldiers who had once fought fiercely for her were now growing restless. The purges and executions of influential figures in the court had left the military high command divided, with generals and officers increasingly questioning their loyalty to the queen. Even Arsinoe herself could feel the shift in the air. The loyalty she had once commanded was beginning to slip away, replaced by whispers of rebellion and dissatisfaction. Her own soldiers, once fiercely loyal, began to doubt whether she could protect them in the long run. The people began to grow restless, no longer fearing the queen who had once been untouchable. They began to question her reign, and in doing so began to erode the power that had made her queen. The final blow came when Arsinoe's own family turned against her. Her sister Arsinoe, once a loyal ally, now joined forces with Arsinoe's enemies. It was a move that shook the very core of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Arsinoe had once been a pawn in Arsinoe's game, but now she was playing her own hand. She aligned herself with the military generals and the courtiers who had grown tired of Arsinoe's reign. Together they launched a rebellion. The rebellion was swift and brutal. With the support of key figures in the military and the court, Arsinoe led a coup that sent Arsinoe's forces scattering. The queen, once a master of manipulation, was now the victim of her own tactics. In the end, Arsinoe was betrayed by the very people she had once trusted, the very family she had fought so hard to control. The once unstoppable queen was now powerless. Her empire had crumbled, and with it, her legacy. Arsinoe II, the woman who had climbed to the top of the Ptolemaic dynasty through blood, betrayal, and ruthlessness, was now nothing more than a tragic figure. The empire she had built in her image fell apart, and Egypt was left to pick up the pieces. The fall of Arsinoe II was not just the collapse of a single ruler. It was the unraveling of an empire built on manipulation, fear, and betrayal. Her reign, though powerful and fleeting, had left a lasting impact on the Ptolemaic dynasty and on Egypt itself. As her empire crumbled, the ripple effects spread throughout the ancient world, forever altering the political landscape of the Mediterranean. In the immediate aftermath of her downfall, Egypt was left in a state of uncertainty. The royal family, once united under the iron grip of Arsinoe, was fractured beyond repair. The power vacuum left by her rebellion and the subsequent betrayal from within the family created an environment ripe for further conflict. But the consequences of her reign stretched far beyond the immediate power struggles. Arsinoe II's policies, particularly her ruthless manipulation of the royal family and the use of incestuous marriages to consolidate power, had forever changed the way future rulers would view authority. Her actions left behind a legacy of distrust and division. Future generations of the Ptolemaic dynasty, including her successors, would struggle to rebuild the power structure she had once held together. Her incestuous marriages, once seen as a necessary evil to preserve the bloodline, would come under scrutiny, leading to debates about the morality of such unions. Arsinoe's blatant disregard for the traditional norms of royalty in favor of consolidating power left a generation questioning the stability of the Ptolemaic rule. Cleopatra VII. The most famous ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty was no stranger to the legacy of Arsinoe II. While Cleopatra sought to bring Egypt back to its former glory, she also had to contend with the political legacy left behind by Arsinoe's reign. The question of how to balance familial loyalty with the need for ruthless power played a significant role in Cleopatra's rise to power. Arsinoe's influence, despite her fall, lingered in the background, shaping the political decisions Cleopatra would make as she navigated her own path to the throne. Beyond Egypt, Arsinoe's actions left a mark on the Mediterranean world. Her bold policies and their resulting consequences served as a cautionary tale to other empires and monarchies. The Ptolemaic dynasty's sudden instability raised questions about the sustainability of dynastic power built solely on family bloodlines and ruthless control. Other kingdoms would watch as the once great empire of Egypt faltered, learning from Arsinoe's rise and fall that the thirst for power when unchecked can tear even the mightiest empires apart. Arsinoe's reign, marked by manipulation, betrayal, and relentless ambition, would ultimately serve as a lesson to those who followed in her footsteps. In the world of power politics, the pursuit of absolute control could be a double-edged sword, one that could bring a ruler to the top, but just as easily send them crashing down. The legacy of Arsinoe II was not just a story of a woman who rose from the depths of betrayal to the height of power. It was a story of how the unchecked lust for power could bring about the downfall of a dynasty. The tale of Arsinoe II was one of great ambition, a thirst for power, and a legacy marked by betrayal. Yet despite her fall from grace and the disintegration of the empire she had built, the lessons of her reign lived on. Her rise marked by calculated moves and strategic marriages, and her fall brought on by the very system she had used to elevate herself, served as a powerful lesson for those who came after her. Arsinoe II's life and reign would serve as a cautionary tale for future rulers, especially those who sought to balance the pursuit of absolute power with familial loyalty. Her willingness to use her own bloodline as a tool for political maneuvering, her reliance on manipulation and coercion, and her eventual destruction at the hands of those closest to her left a haunting reminder. Power, when achieved through deceit and betrayal, is fragile, and those who think they can control the game with force will often find that the very forces they manipulate will one day turn on them. For Egypt, the loss of Arsinoe II was a significant blow. The Ptolemaic dynasty, though resilient, was shaken by her fall, and the power vacuum left in her wake was felt across the kingdom. The disarray that followed allowed external forces to exploit Egypt's vulnerability. Egypt would never fully recover from the toll of Arsinoe's reign. Her policies, though effective in their time, set the stage for instability. But the lessons of Arsinoe's reign did not only affect Egypt. The rest of the Mediterranean world watched as the once mighty Ptolemaic dynasty crumbled. Rulers in Greece, Rome, and beyond looked at Arsinoe II's rise and fall, and saw the dangers of unchecked ambition. Her story became a case study in the consequences of ruling by force and manipulation, a reminder that political power, no matter how strategically achieved, could never replace the trust and loyalty that a ruler must build with their people. For the future rulers of Egypt, and even beyond Arsinoe II's legacy, would serve as a double-edged sword. She had shown what could be accomplished through sheer will and intellect, and yet her downfall proved the dangers of becoming too obsessed with control, too dependent on manipulation. She had used her royal bloodline as both shield and sword, but in doing so she had ultimately destroyed the very foundation of her rule. Her story, tragic yet captivating, would remain in the annals of history as a stark reminder of what happens when a ruler disregards the moral compass in favor of absolute power. Even as generations of rulers came and went, Arsinoe II's name would be spoken of with reverence and caution. In the end, her reign was not just a tale of a woman who fought for power. It was a story of the costs of ambition, the consequences of betrayal, and the enduring impact one ruler's actions can have on an entire empire. The reign of Arsinoe II, filled with political scheming, betrayal, and eventual collapse, left behind more than just a fractured dynasty. It left a legacy of lessons that would resonate for centuries. The story of her rise to power, her manipulation of family ties, and her ultimate fall from grace became a somber reflection on the dangers of absolute power and the lengths to which a ruler could go. Arsinoe's life was a reminder that the thirst for power, when pursued without moral restraint, comes at a high cost. She had been betrayed by her family, exiled, and ultimately brought down by the very forces she had used. In the end, she paid the ultimate price for her ruthlessness. But her story was not one of mere tragedy. It was a profound lesson about the limits of control. Yet Arsinoe's legacy was not entirely defined by her downfall. Despite the political instability, her reign caused her strategic brilliance, her intellect, and her ability to survive in the brutal world of royal politics cannot be overlooked. She was a woman who understood the game of power better than most, and though her methods were controversial, there was no denying her skill in navigating the dangerous world of dynastic politics. The world she left behind was not one of honor or righteousness, but one shaped by cold, calculated moves. Arsinoe II had understood the Game of Thrones better than anyone, but the very strategies that had brought her success. Her reign, marked by manipulation, ruthless tactics, and incestuous marriages, was a reflection of a larger political reality, a world where family loyalty and love were secondary to the pursuit of power. The lessons of Arsinoe's life resonated not only within Egypt, but throughout the Mediterranean world. Her story became a case study in the dangers of unchecked ambition and the consequences of ruling with force rather than compassion. Her name, forever tied to scandal and intrigue, became a symbol of the fragility of power. While her dynasty fell, her actions influenced the rulers who came after her. But beyond the political and historical implications of her reign, the story of Arsinoe II is also one of resilience and survival. In a world that sought to crush her at every turn, she fought her way to the top. She faced betrayal, abuse, and isolation, yet she remained unyielding in her quest for power. And in the end, while her reign collapsed, Arsinoe II showed the world the price of ambition. Her story leaves us with questions that echo through history. How much is too much when it comes to power? How far can one go before the weight of their own decisions causes everything to unravel? And perhaps most importantly, what is the true cost of a legacy built on manipulation and betrayal? Arsinoe II's life, her rise and her fall, serve as a stark reminder that power, while seductive, is never secure. It can be taken away in an instant, as it was for her. And history will remember those who use it not just for what they achieve, but for the price others pay to make that achievement possible. Her empire may have fallen, but her legacy, marked by ambition, tragedy, and the consequences of power, will continue to resonate for generations to come.